Painted Smiling Face by Corrosion and Conformity. I was thinking, what am I going to say about this song? And initially I was thinking, probably not much. I can't think of anything that's really standing out, and it seems basic, and I kind of ran a blank. But then I tuned into vibrato, and that led into a number of interesting kind of thought pathways with the vibrato. First, if you look at the first riff on here, I guess I'm calling it intro, there's a slide from the 3rd fret to the 5th fret, and there's a little vibrato there. And when you play that right, the song or the riff is like magic. It just sounds fantastic. And the vibrato and the what would be the vibrations of the wavelengths and just doing all that just makes that riff sound great. And so I looked at my playthrough on this, and I'm thinking, man, I'm doing a lot of vibratos. I don't tend to do vibratos. It's kind of a foreign thing for me. And why is that? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that 90s metal doesn't utilize the technique for the most part. It's not something you're going to run into on most 90s thrash. So then it took me down another avenue of thinking was, there was this saying or kind of mindset with Corrosion of Conformity when this album came out, that it was a crossover album. And so then I started thinking back to, what was my first exposure with it. And as best as I can remember, my first exposure was seeing them in support of this album, playing it live, and I probably didn't have the album or know who they were beforehand, and thought they were a skater band. And I've never really worked backwards in their songs, in their history of their writing from that point. They did a lot of prolific stuff afterwards, and I paid attention to it from that point on. And in terms of thinking of crossover, you have the mindset, or I have the mindset of, they're coming from a different genre is implied with that. And if they're coming from a different genre, what's going to be different? And so the vibrato is different. Also, what's different is their rests. This song made me count out rests like 2 or 3 times. And I guess part of me is resentful of that because, that takes effort to figure out what the count is and then practice it and hit it. Well, if you think of, if you're going to be playing Anthrax or older Metallica songs, you never had to sit out and count rests. You just blast right into it. So I bring that up in that, it's maybe that's a crossover aspect. The vibrato, they do fantastic. And I think it's something that really, I can't recall it being played much in the thrash scene. So interesting tool that I guess was just overall neglected. So let's jump into, and the other thing about this particular song is my tab sheets came out to like 14 sheets. In comparison to the other songs, that's a considerable amount. So that just means more work in doing this one particular tutorial, and maybe it's my fault for not taking more effort to look at the rye figures and condense them and better transcribe it, but that's what I ended up with. So let's take a look at the first page, see if something stands out on this one. The intro riff, as I mentioned, has the vibrato. Oh, yes. I've got to take one more step back. So on the playthrough, in many cases, I was leaving out the vibrato because if I played it, I would forget the next riff. And I'm thinking, why is that? Why is it so challenging for me to think about consciously playing this vibrato and then being ready for the next change? And I believe it's just because I never do that move. You come from a 90s metal background, you don't do the vibrato. So that was interesting. That was part of the consequence for me of not doing that simple guitar playing technique. And my playthrough could have been much better if I wasn't struggling with remembering the next riff, because I'm doing a fingering that my mind wasn't used to. So that was an interesting insight for me, is if there's something a little off on what you're accustomed to doing, the flow, the breakup on a good clean flow really could have a little longer consequence than just at the time frame of that riff. So jumping back to page 1. So there's some artificial harmonics on there, and be aware that when you do the artificial harmonics, you kind of roll your thumb over to slightly mute the string that you've just hit with the pick. The percussive rakes at the 32 second riff, the riff at 32 seconds, those are real percussive rakes. And I say real because if you've been playing metal songs for a long time and remember the evolution of tabs, like if you would have went and got one of the original Megadeth tab books, as far as I can tell, they were just horrible and horribly inaccurate. And everything was a percussive rake on there, and my suspicion is it was probably more of a muted power chord than a percussive rake. But I believe in this case, they're really doing percussive rakes, so they're not fingering any power chords. It's just straight up muting it. So that's kind of special. I think it's something that we've seen in the tabs, but were the artists really doing it? In most cases, I suspected no. Then the riff at the 34 seconds, there's an upstroke. And pay attention to that, because I think they do a lot of upstrokes, and much like the vibrato, that's something that I normally wouldn't do, but it's them. And as I'm about ready to wrap up this sheet 1, I figure I'll say something else just because I find it intriguing. Maybe you'll find it intriguing. I have a friend that was an artist rep, and when he was telling me about Lamb of God, and he was working on a riff, and he was talking to one of the guitarists about how to play it, and he goes, yeah, me and the other guitarist, we make it a point of trying to stump the other guy. So if you think of a band like Lamb of God, they're going to be trying to write riffs that are just going to crush their other guitarist, doing that for fun. That's not what I get a feeling of with Corrosion and Conformity. With Corrosion and Conformity, it feels more of a blending of, let's not push the boundaries of our abilities, but let's write catchy stuff. Let's write catchy stuff that's on time. And kind of have two guitarists become one of mindset and playability, and not so much like let's push ourselves to the extremes. Let's just get in lockstep. So that's also important if you're a guitarist such as myself with limited fluidity and limited dexterity. It opens up the ability to play their songs. And again, so more creep of thought here. As we all know, when we're doing a tab song, we are playing their songs, and it's important to keep that in mind, because the songs are unique to the writers, and if you can't play it exactly like them, don't beat yourself up over it, because you have your own unique abilities. And if you spent the time if you spent the time seasoning yourself, or what would it be, 5-10 years of just being in a band, you're going to write some pretty cool stuff too. And you may never write stuff that's going to be like Corrosion and Conformity or Lamb of God, but you're going to be writing stuff that is unique to the way your mind thinks and your hands work. And so keep that in mind. If your favorite band and the song you want to learn and you can't do the riff, well, it's not yours. So don't beat yourself up over it.